People who were hiding Jews, they were condemned at the minimum to go to jail, but normally they were simply shooting down. They put them against a wall. So they were really risking their life.
Et comme on le sait, ces établissements seront aussi fermement contrôlés par l'occupant, qui n'hésitera pas à venir à l'improviste pour effectuer des visites. Quoi qu'il en soit, ce qui se passe dans les homes concerne Yvonne Nevejean. Et en cas de nécessité, elle n'hésitera pas à intervenir dans le cadre de ses attributions légalement établies.
Belgium had fallen into the grip of an oppressive regime, and fear lingered in every corner of the country. The once peaceful streets of Brussels were now a place of uncertainty, where neighbors whispered in hushed voices, and trust was a rare commodity. In the midst of this chaos, Yvonne Nevejean, a woman of profound moral conviction, sat at her desk in the Office National de l'Enfance, National Office for Children, contemplating a decision that would change her life and the lives of countless children forever. Yvonne's office was a sanctuary of sorts. In these troubling times, she had always believed in the innocence of children and their right to be protected, no matter the circumstances. But as the occupation tightened its grip, her role as the director of child welfare began to take on a new, darker meaning. Families were disappearing. Rumors swirled about the fates of Jewish children, and the desperate pleas for help that reached Yvonne's desk grew more urgent with each passing day. It started small, as these things often do. A mother came to her, eyes red from tears, clutching her child's hand tightly, as if letting go would mean losing her forever. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They're coming. I can't keep her safe. You have to help me." The desperation in that mother's voice was something Yvonne couldn't forget. The child beside her, no more than 6 years old, looked up with wide, innocent eyes, not understanding the gravity of the situation, but sensing the fear in her mother's trembling hands. Yvonne knew in that moment that she couldn't turn them away. But helping them, hiding this child from the authorities, was dangerous. It wasn't just the mother and daughter who would be at risk. It would be Yvonne, her colleagues, and anyone who dared to stand against the regime. Still, she knew she couldn't ignore the call. She couldn't pretend the problem didn't exist. In that instant, Yvonne made a decision that would set her on a path of resistance, a path fraught with unimaginable risks. She would find a way to hide the children. Yvonne's position gave her access to a vast network of child welfare workers, schools, orphanages, and religious institutions. She began quietly reaching out to people she trusted, people who, like her, believed that saving innocent lives was worth the risk. It wasn't long before she had gathered a small but dedicated group of individuals willing to take children into hiding. They were teachers, nuns, priests, and everyday families who saw the injustice unfolding around them and refused to look away. Together, they began creating a system that would hide Jewish children in plain sight. The children would be placed in homes, schools, and convents, given new names, and blended into Belgian society. It was a dangerous operation, but Yvonne's careful planning and calm demeanor kept the network functioning smoothly. The first child they placed was the little girl whose mother had come to Yvonne's office that fateful day. Yvonne arranged for her to be taken to a convent in a remote village, far from the prying eyes of the authorities. The journey to the convent was tense. Yvonne accompanied the child, riding in the back of a rickety old car driven by a trusted colleague. The road was long and winding, and every shadow seemed to hide a threat. But Yvonne kept her fear hidden, focusing instead on the safety of the child sitting beside her. When they arrived, the nuns welcomed the child with open arms, understanding the gravity of the situation without a word needing to be spoken. As they led the little girl inside, Yvonne felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. She had saved one life, but there were so many more who needed her help. By the winter of 1940, Yvonne's network had grown. More children were being placed into hiding, and the risks were increasing. The regime was relentless in its pursuit, and any hint of defiance was met with severe consequences. But Yvonne remained undeterred. She knew the stakes. Every child saved was another victory, another life spared from an unthinkable fate. The process was meticulous. Each child was given a new identity, complete with falsified papers and a carefully crafted backstory. Yvonne's team coordinated every detail, from the clothes the children would wear to the new names they would adopt. It was a delicate balance between safety and secrecy, and Yvonne knew that one mistake could expose the entire operation. One of the most challenging parts of the process was helping the children adjust to their new lives. They were young, often confused and scared. Yvonne spent countless hours comforting them, explaining why they couldn't see their parents and why they had to remember their new names. It was heartbreaking work. Many of the children cried for their families, their voices small and filled with uncertainty. But Yvonne reassured them with gentle words, promising that they would be safe. "You must be brave," she would say, her voice soft but firm. "One day, you'll understand." One such child was a boy named Daniel. He was 7 years old, with dark curls and a quiet, serious demeanor. Daniel's parents had disappeared, leaving him in the care of a neighbor who, fearing for her own safety, brought him to Yvonne's office. Daniel said little, but Yvonne could see the sadness in his eyes. She placed him in a small village with a family who treated him as one of their own. Yvonne visited him often, checking on his safety and offering what comfort she could. Each time she left, Daniel would ask, "Will I see my parents again?" Yvonne didn't have the heart to answer truthfully, so she would simply say, "You're safe here. That's what matters now." As the months passed, Yvonne's operation became a lifeline for Jewish children across Belgium. She and her network worked tirelessly, placing child after child into hiding, always staying one step ahead of the authorities. But the danger was growing, the regime was becoming more suspicious, and the consequences of discovery were severe. Yvonne knew that their time was running out, still she refused to stop. "Every child we save is a life that would have been lost," she told her colleagues in a hushed meeting one night. "We can't give up." And so, the operation continued, a quiet but powerful resistance that defied the darkness sweeping across Europe. Yvonne Nevejean had become a protector of the innocent, a beacon of hope in a time of unimaginable fear. She knew the risks, she knew the dangers, but as long as there were children to save, she would not back down. By the summer of 1941, Yvonne Nevejean's operation had grown into one of the largest child rescue networks in Belgium. What had begun with a few desperate whispers had now evolved into a full-scale resistance effort. Every day, more Jewish children were brought to her office, their fates hanging in the balance. Each one was a life to be saved, but the weight of those lives weighed heavily on Yvonne's shoulders. She was no longer just an administrator, she had become a key player in the fight to protect the innocent. But with the growing number of children, the risks also multiplied. The regime's forces were becoming more vigilant, and the search for anyone who dared to hide children became increasingly aggressive. Yvonne knew that her network's success was fragile. They were walking a tightrope, and one misstep could bring everything crashing down. The dangers were never far from Yvonne's mind, but she kept her focus on the children. She met every new challenge with quiet determination. Her office, once a place of routine paperwork and child welfare cases, had become a secret hub of resistance. Hidden beneath the official documents were lists of children in hiding, their new names, and the locations where they had been placed. One evening, after a long day of arranging new placements, Yvonne sat at her desk, exhausted. Her office was dimly lit, and the silence of the building made the ticking of the clock on the wall seem unbearably loud. She stared down at the papers in front of her. Another list of children who needed to be moved, more decisions to make, more lives to save. "We have to keep going," she whispered to herself, as if saying it aloud would make the impossible seem more achievable. Just then, a knock at her door broke the silence. One of her colleagues, a young woman named Claire, entered with a grave expression. "Yvonne," she said softly, "I've just heard some disturbing news. The authorities are planning a raid on a school we've been using to hide children. We need to move them tonight." Yvonne's heart raced. She had been expecting this moment, but it still hit her like a blow. The danger was getting closer. Without a word, she stood up, grabbed her coat, and began making arrangements. There was no time to waste. The children had to be moved before dawn. That night, Yvonne and Claire worked tirelessly to organize the relocation. The children, 6 in total, were spread across different homes and schools, but they all needed to be moved to safer locations immediately. The most difficult part was ensuring that each child's papers and identity were in order. If they were stopped, everything needed to be perfect. there could be no room for suspicion. By midnight, Yvonne and her team had gathered the children, guiding them quietly through the darkened streets. They were frightened, clutching the hands of their caretakers and trying to make sense of what was happening. One little girl, no more than 5 years old, looked up at Yvonne with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Where are we going?" she asked in a small voice. Yvonne knelt down, her face softening. "We're taking you somewhere safe," she whispered, brushing the girl's hair out of her face. "You don't need to be afraid." But deep inside, Yvonne couldn't shake the fear. Every sound on the street, the distant rumble of a car, the echo of footsteps, felt like a threat. They passed through quiet neighborhoods, the weight of the darkness pressing down on them, and Yvonne held her breath every time they neared a corner, dreading what might be waiting. When they finally arrived at the safe house, a small farm on the outskirts of town, Yvonne felt a rush of relief. The children were ushered inside, and Yvonne took a moment to stand outside, the cool night air brushing against her skin. She had done it this time, but the reality was inescapable. Every successful rescue brought them closer to discovery. The pressure was mounting, and Yvonne felt it more intensely with each passing day. She could see the strain on her colleagues' faces, the weariness that came from living in constant fear. But for Yvonne, the weight was even greater. She had placed herself at the center of this operation, and the responsibility for these children's lives felt crushing at times. One afternoon, as Yvonne prepared for yet another meeting with her network, she received a visit from a priest who had been helping to hide children in his parish. He looked troubled, and his voice was tense as he spoke. "Yvonne, we've had a close call. They're asking more questions now. It's only a matter of time before they start looking harder." Yvonne nodded, her expression calm but her mind racing. "We knew this day would come," she said. "We'll need to be even more careful." The priest shook his head. "How long can we keep doing this? How many more risks can we take?" Yvonne's heart ached at the question, but she pushed it aside. "As long as there are children who need us," she replied firmly. "We can't stop. I can't let them down." Despite her outward resolve, the emotional toll on Yvonne was immense. She spent sleepless nights replaying the day's events in her mind, wondering if she had made the right decisions, if she had done enough. The children she had placed in hiding were never far from her thoughts. Each one had a face, a name, a story, and each one represented a life hanging in the balance. One evening, after visiting a family who had taken in 2 brothers, Yvonne found herself overcome with emotion. The boys had asked her about their parents, where they were, when they would see them again. Yvonne had no answers for them. She had to hold back her tears as she reassured them, knowing that their future was uncertain at best. Later that night, Yvonne sat alone in her small apartment, staring out the window at the darkened city below. The weight of it all, the fear, the responsibility, the endless uncertainty, pressed down on her. She had always been strong, but in moments like this, she wondered how much longer she could carry this burden. "I'm doing what I have to," she whispered to herself, "for them." It was a quiet, solemn promise, a promise that she would continue, no matter the cost. By late 1942, the stakes had risen to terrifying new heights. Yvonne Nevejean's network was now responsible for hiding over 100 children, and the weight of her responsibility felt suffocating. Every child saved was a small victory, but each new placement also increased the risk of exposure. The authorities were tightening their grip, and every whisper, every stray glance seemed to carry the threat of discovery. The fear was palpable. Yvonne could feel it in every interaction, in every exchange of hurried words behind closed doors. Her network of brave individuals, priests, nuns, teachers, and ordinary families, had become experts in secrecy. But even experts make mistakes, and Yvonne knew that one wrong move could bring everything crashing down. It was a cold, rainy afternoon when Yvonne received the news. A family that had been sheltering 2 children in a small village had been questioned by the authorities. "They're watching us more closely now," her colleague whispered urgently over the phone. "They know something's not right, and they're looking for anyone who might be helping." Yvonne felt a chill run down her spine. She knew this day would come, but hearing it confirmed was like a punch to the gut. Her mind raced. The children, the families, the entire network was at risk. One crack in their carefully constructed system, and it could all unravel. "We need to move them," Yvonne said, her voice steady despite the rising panic inside her. All of them. That night, she and her most trusted allies worked frantically to organize the evacuation of children from several safe houses. It was a logistical nightmare, finding new places for so many children in such a short time. But Yvonne refused to let fear control her. She knew what was at stake. The operation had to be executed with military precision. Every detail mattered. The children were moved in small groups, often under the cover of darkness. Yvonne herself oversaw many of the transfers, her heart pounding with each step. She knew the authorities were growing suspicious, but she had no choice. The children's lives were in her hands. One particular night still haunted Yvonne long after it had passed. She had been moving 3 children from a convent to a remote farmhouse on the outskirts of a village. The children, all under the age of 8, were terrified, clinging to her as they walked through the darkened streets. Yvonne whispered reassuring words, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As they neared the farmhouse, Yvonne heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind them. Her heart raced. They were being followed. Without a second thought, Yvonne led the children off the road and into a nearby forest, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. They crouched low behind a thicket of bushes, the children's small hands gripping Yvonne's tightly. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Yvonne held her breath, willing herself to stay calm. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps finally faded into the distance. Yvonne exhaled shakily, her pulse still racing. They had narrowly escaped being caught, but the danger had never felt more real. The close call shook Yvonne to her core. She had always known the risks, but now, they felt more immediate than ever. The authorities were closing in, and their methods were becoming more ruthless. Yvonne gathered her network the next day, her face pale but her voice resolute. "We have to be invisible," she said, her tone firm and unwavering. "We can't leave a trace. No paperwork, no records, nothing that ties us to these children." Her colleagues nodded in agreement, but the tension in the room was palpable. They were all living on borrowed time, and they knew it. Every day the noose tightened a little more, and every day the risk of exposure grew. Despite the mounting pressure, Yvonne refused to give up. The children needed them, and as long as there were lives to save, she would keep fighting. But the weight of that fight was growing heavier with each passing day. Yvonne's worst fears were realized when one of her trusted contacts, a man who had been helping to move children, was arrested. Under interrogation, he revealed the names of several key members of the network. Yvonne was devastated. "We've been exposed," she said quietly to Claire, her closest ally, as they sat together in her office late one night. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke, the gravity of the situation sinking in. "They know about us now." The betrayal was a crushing blow. Yvonne had always known that trust was fragile in times like these, but she hadn't expected it to be broken so suddenly, so brutally. The network was in immediate danger, and they had to act fast. "We need to dismantle the network," Claire said, her voice shaking with urgency. "We have to protect the children before it's too late." Yvonne nodded, her mind already racing with plans. It would be risky, but they had no other choice. They would scatter the children across the country, moving them to places so remote that even the authorities wouldn't be able to find them. In the weeks that followed, Yvonne and her team worked around the clock to relocate the children. It was a race against time, and every day felt like a gamble. They moved the children in small groups, using back roads and hidden paths to avoid detection. The tension was unbearable, but Yvonne remained focused, refusing to let fear consume her. One of the most dangerous moments came when they had to move a group of children through a heavily patrolled area. Yvonne, knowing the risk, insisted on going herself to oversee the operation. As they neared the checkpoint, Yvonne's heart pounded in her chest. The children were disguised as refugees, their new papers carefully prepared. But if the authorities asked too many questions, if they looked too closely, they made it through, but the relief was fleeting. Yvonne knew they were only delaying the inevitable. The regime's grip was tightening, and soon there would be nowhere left to hide. Despite the close calls, despite the betrayals and the fear that gnawed at her every waking moment, Yvonne remained steadfast. "We can't stop now," she told her team during one of their final meetings. "As long as there are children to protect, we keep going." The emotion in her voice was palpable. She had given everything to this mission, her time, her energy, her very soul. The children had become her purpose, and she couldn't let them down. But deep inside, Yvonne knew the end was coming. The pressure was unbearable, the risks too great. And yet, even as the walls closed in, she refused to give up. By 1944, the war had reached a critical turning point. As the tide began to shift in favor of the Allied forces, the regime became more desperate, more ruthless. Yvonne Nevejean's network, once a fragile web of secrecy and bravery, was now stretched to its limit. Hundreds of Jewish children had been saved, hidden in homes, convents, and schools across Belgium. But the stakes had never been higher. The authorities were growing more suspicious, and every move carried the weight of life or death. Yvonne's quiet determination had turned her into one of the most important figures in the underground resistance to save children. But as the war dragged on, the danger intensified. Every day felt like a ticking clock, and Yvonne knew the endgame was approaching. It was late in the autumn of 1944 when Yvonne received the news that her network had feared for months. The authorities were closing in on their operation. There were whispers of arrests, rumors of informants, and sightings of officers in areas where children had been hidden. It was only a matter of time before the full weight of the regime came crashing down on them. Yvonne stood in her office, staring out the window at the gray, rain-soaked streets. Her heart raced, but her mind was already working through the problem. They had been here before. Narrow escapes, last-minute rescues. But this time, it felt different. The pressure had reached a boiling point, and Yvonne knew that one false move could be the end of everything. "They're closing in," Claire whispered that evening, her voice barely audible as they met in the back room of a church. "We have to dismantle the entire network. It's no longer safe for the children to stay where they are." Yvonne didn't flinch. "Then we move them," she replied, her voice calm but filled with the weight of the decision. "All of them. Tonight." The next few hours were a blur of frantic activity. Yvonne and her most trusted allies worked in secret, coordinating the relocation of every child in their care. It was an enormous task. Moving dozens of children across the country without raising suspicion required perfect timing and flawless execution. The plan was dangerous, but it was their only chance. Yvonne herself took responsibility for some of the most perilous moves. One of the most urgent cases involved a group of 8 children hiding in a convent on the outskirts of Brussels. The authorities had already begun questioning the local villagers, and Yvonne knew it was only a matter of time before they came for the convent. Under the cover of night, Yvonne and a small group of resistance members made their way to the convent, where the children waited in silence, their small faces pale with fear. "We have to be quick," Yvonne whispered as she knelt down beside one of the younger boys. "Stay close to me, and don't make a sound." The children, sensing the gravity of the situation, nodded solemnly. They had learned to be brave in the face of fear, but Yvonne could see the anxiety in their eyes. She took the boy's hand, squeezing it gently. "You're going to be safe," she whispered, though her heart ached with the uncertainty of her own words. The journey was excruciatingly slow. Every step felt like it could be their last, and every sound seemed amplified in the dead of night. Yvonne's senses were heightened to an unbearable degree. The rustle of leaves, the distant bark of a dog, the muffled footsteps of her companions. But the most terrifying moment came as they approached a checkpoint, manned by officers whose sharp eyes scanned the streets for anything suspicious. Yvonne's breath caught in her throat as they approached. The children were hidden in the back of a cart, covered by blankets and old sacks of grain. Yvonne herself rode at the front, her hands trembling slightly as she held the reins of the horse. Claire sat beside her, trying to appear calm, but Yvonne could feel the tension radiating from her. As they neared the checkpoint, Yvonne forced herself to remain composed. The officer in charge stepped forward, his eyes cold and calculating. "What's your business at this hour?" he demanded, his gaze sweeping over the cart. Yvonne swallowed hard. "We're transporting supplies to the farm on the other side of the village," she said, her voice steady despite the panic rising inside her. The officer narrowed his eyes, glancing toward the back of the cart. For a heart-stopping moment, Yvonne feared he would search the cart and discover the children hidden beneath the sacks. But then, almost as if by some miracle, he waved them through. Yvonne didn't allow herself to breathe until they were well past the checkpoint. Her hands shook with the release of tension, but she kept her emotions in check. There was no time to celebrate their narrow escape. They still had miles to go before the children would be safe. After what felt like an eternity, they finally arrived at a remote farmhouse where the children would be hidden. The farmer's wife, a brave woman who had already sheltered several children, greeted them quietly at the door. One by one, the children were led inside, their faces pale but grateful. As Yvonne prepared to leave, one of the older girls, a child named Miriam, tugged on her coat. "Will I ever see my parents again?" she asked, her voice trembling with the weight of her question. Yvonne's heart clenched. She had faced this question before, and each time it cut deeper. She knelt down to Miriam's level, her eyes soft but filled with the burden of the truth. "I don't know," she said gently, her voice breaking slightly. "But you're safe here, and that's what matters now." Miriam nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "Thank you," she whispered, her small voice barely audible in the stillness of the night. Yvonne smiled, though it was a smile tinged with sorrow. She hugged the girl tightly, knowing that this might be the last time they saw each other. But she couldn't let that stop her. The fight wasn't over. As 1945 dawned, the war was nearing its end. The regime was collapsing, but the danger had not yet passed. Yvonne's network continued to operate in the shadows, moving children to safety, always one step ahead of those who sought to tear them apart. In the final days of the war, Yvonne stood in her office, staring at the long list of names in front of her. Children who had been saved, families who had risked everything. She knew the end was near, but she also knew the work they had done would never be forgotten. "We did it," Claire said quietly as she stood beside Yvonne, her voice filled with awe. "We saved them." Yvonne nodded, her eyes misting over with emotion. "We did what we had to," she replied softly, her voice filled with a quiet strength. "For them,